We are privileged today to have a fascinating speaker, a presenter at last year's Chicago Humanities Festival, Eric Oliver, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Professor Oliver will be speaking to us today about Enchanted Americans. By this, he does not mean exactly people who believe that they live among witches, fairies, and ogres, but rather people who are under the spell of their own magical thinking. Whether they fear genetically modified foods or believe in angels, people across the political spectrum are willing to attribute causality to unseen forces. Professor Oliver explores the various phenomena that lurk behind this anti-scientific thinking, as well as the ways those perceptions inform and distort their understanding of politics. Please help me in welcoming Professor Oliver.
Thank you so much for coming out on a cold Sunday. I have to say it's also great to be able to share these ideas with you. I spend most of my time working in my office with my computer alone, so it's great to actually come interact with people. So I'm eager to hear your comments. Let me get right into this. As a lot of you know, in September 11th, 2001, two hijacked jets were flown into the World Trade Center, causing explosions, a subsequent collapse of the World Trade Center. There was an official explanation that came years afterwards with the 9/11 Commission, and that was basically the story of the 9/11 Commission, was that a small group of terrorists had hijacked these planes, flown them into the World Trade Center. The interesting thing is, even though this was the official account and is probably accepted by most people, a lot of people do not accept this account. And in some of the surveys that I've done, we ask people, for example, do you believe how much you agree with the statement that a small number of government officials secretly planned the attacks of September 11, 2001 because they wanted America to go to war in the Middle East. And this is an alternative count that often flows around in the public. And about 20% of Americans, we've asked this on several surveys, typically agree with this statement. We see this with other types of conspiracy theories. For example, do you believe that a percent of Americans who believe that Obama was not really a citizen and not born in the United States? Usually about 24% of the population agrees with that. Chemtrails, the sort of vapor trails that come from behind jets, asking that as a program of secret government spraying. About 12% of the population usually agrees with that. Asking people whether or not they think the Food and Drug Administration is deliberately withholding natural cures for cancer from pharmaceutical pressure. You get about 40% of the population who agrees with that statement. The interesting thing is if you look at these kinds of conspiracy theories, they actually correspond with a lot of other beliefs. For example, the percentages of Americans believing in supernatural and paranormal beliefs. About 70% of our country believe in angels. About 55% believe in Satan. About 73% believe in extrasensory perception. About 42% believe in ghosts. Similarly, a lot of Americans reject science at very high percentages. About 52% of the population say that they don't believe in evolution. About 20% think that vaccines cause autism and other psychological disorders. And about 30% of Americans think that eliminating gluten will make them healthier regardless of whether they have celiac disease. Celiac disease is actually a small percentage of the population. Now, the interesting thing for us, and 40% think that dinosaurs and humans coexisted. So what is fascinating for me as somebody who's interested in studying why Americans believe what they believe is how these things are related. In other words, the likelihood that you believe that Obama faked his birth certificate is actually highly correlated with your likelihood that you believe that eliminating gluten from your diet will make you healthier, which is also correlated with your likelihood of believing in ghosts. And one way to sort of describe this is a person who I've known most of my life, an old family friend. Her name is Linda Kelly. She lives in Canyon Lake, Texas. And at first blush, Linda looks like the kind of liberal one would find, maybe in Evanston or Hyde Park or Berkeley or Cambridge. She prioritizes natural food. She advocates homeschooling. She avoids vaccines. She supports bank regulation. She wants to get rid of GMOs. She thinks they're terrible. Wants to expand Medicare. But Linda's also a Tea Party activist. She describes herself as a born-again Christian. She thinks Obama faked his birth certificate. She hates Obamacare, although she can't really describe what exactly it does. And, and she has all sorts of other sort of conspiratorial narratives that she embraces about American politics. And for a long time I would sit with Linda and I would try to reconcile her various views and the inconsistencies in her views, and I would try to point out their contradictions in some ways. And at one point, she sort of smiled at me and she said something very pressing. She said, "Do you know what the difference is between you and me is you believe in reason and I believe in the Bible." And what she means by that is, Linda is a very pragmatic, ordered person, but what she says is that the kind of view that I embrace in the world, she doesn't have much use for, this kind of post-Enlightenment, reason-based perspective on the world. Instead, she draws her worldview from a much different source. And I think this is if we look back on it, this is a very strange thing. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, had a common idea that with the advance of science and the Enlightenment, we were supposed to become disenchanted, as he word. The kind of magical thinking that was rampant in medieval Europe was supposed to dissipate under the progressive regime of rationality and reason and science. And in fact, Max Weber would be very puzzled by this, because what is going on, he might say. And I think the difficulty that those of us who actually study or are in the social sciences, we tend to sort of embrace these viewpoints. And we kind of think that most Americans think the way we think, which is they should have some sort of core principles, overarching principles about how the world operates, from this, they can deduce their preferences about what they like, what they don't like, and what they want, and what they should advocate. And from that, they sort of have their informed opinions. And this is a very reason-based kind of post-Enlightenment view that would be familiar to someone like Immanuel Kant. Instead, most Americans, I think, view the world like this, or like this, in terms of a host of conspiracy theories, or even a more kind of naturalistic kind of magic. And so when I started uncovering these kinds of things, I became really fascinated by this. And what this project is an attempt to do is really explore magical thinking in America. And it's two things, one of which is why do so many people embrace magical beliefs? Why do people hold on to this type of magical thinking, and trying to explain that? And then as a political scientist, I'm ultimately very interested in how these things relate to political discourse, political organization, parties in the United States. And so I actually think this actually has a very, very big impact on our politics. And one of the claims I'm going to make in this talk is that the divisions that we often ascribe to sort of being between liberals and conservatives, I think really miss a bigger point. I think there's a much bigger gulf in the United States between what I would call sort of pre-Enlightenment, kind of enchanted or intuitionist type thinkers, and post-Enlightenment, disenchanted, kind of reason-based thinkers. And those who primarily utilize this kind of intuition-based kind of political knowledge come to very, very different conclusions and very different understandings about how politics in the world operates than those who use kind of reason-based approaches. So let me start with some beginning questions. When I say magical thinking, some people take umbrage with this idea. Well, what do we mean by magical thinking or magical beliefs? And I want to say magical beliefs have two key components to them. First off, they typically assign the source of some event to an unknown phenomenon, unobservable phenomena, whether it's some hidden god, some hidden power, some hidden superstitious force that's out there. It's the idea that something that we cannot observe is causing something in our world to happen. Now, that in and of itself does not make it magical thinking. We could say there are a lot of scientific theories, for example, about things that we cannot observe that we are simply speculating about, things like dark energy and dark matter. What makes something magical thinking is when that belief in the unobservable phenomena comes and contradicts something that is an alternative explanation that is based on some observable data. And so ultimately what magical thinking is, it's a transgressive way of thinking. It's embracing an alternative explanation that's not empirically verifiable, even though there's some alternative empirical story that's out there. And so the interesting question is why would people embrace magical thinking? What are the circumstances that cause all of us engage in magical thinking at some level, now, as I'll explain in a moment, but what causes us to do this? And I think there are basically two important parts of this. The first explanation came from Bronislaw Malinowski. Some of you may be familiar with it. He's one of the fathers of modern anthropology. And Malinowski went to the Trobriand Islands in the early part of the 20th century to study magical thinking and magical beliefs amongst the Trobriand Islanders. Now, the Trobriand Islanders at the time were a very magical, superstitious people. They didn't have a written language. They did not have iron tools. They seemed to be a very foraging, much more kind of primitive society. And so it seemed like an opportunity for Malinowski to sort of study humans at that time. And what Malinowski came to conclude was that the magical thinking amongst the Trobriand Islanders was not a sign of sort of mental deficiency or inadequacy or even lack of sophistication. They actually had some very complex technological solutions to problems in their environment. What Malinowski came to realize is that magical beliefs, like, are tools, and in a sense, they have tools that serve emotional functions for us. And for the Trobriand Islanders, their magical beliefs basically were emotional palliatives. They made them feel better. And that they would engage in magical thinking as a way when they encountered circumstances that generated a lot of apprehension. And let me explain how this works, maybe from a little bit more of a neuroscience perspective. So imagine here we are. Most of the time, our bodies and our psychology is meant to sort of exist in kind of a homeostatic set point. Like, we're neither necessarily happy, sad, angry, or anything. We want to be kind of in a neutral, energy conserving mode. And we generally go through the world in this way. And our psychology operates processing information in this way. And this is what psychologists often call system one thinking, which is very kind of habitual and fast and oriented. And sometimes, though, we encounter a stimulus in our environment, something that disrupts our pattern, something that can seem like a threat to us. When we get this, we basically move into an emotional state. This emotional state, basically fear, is there to motivate us, to motivate us to protect us from the threat that's out there. And so in this case, we see a snake, we encounter fear, we get motivated to move away from the snake, we want to eliminate it and return ourselves, we run away, and we want to return back to our emotional homeostatic set point. What the emotion is there to do is really to motivate us to move back to some set point and respond to the environment in that way. Now, that's fine when we sort of see recognizable threats in our environment. But the problem that we have, and particularly as a species that's very prominent for humans, is that we have this incredible imagination. And we can see into the future and think about the future. We can imagine things. And so we can encounter a lot of things where we have a lot of uncertainty. And so there are various things in our lives where we're encountering uncertainty. And sometimes this uncertainty can be very, very pressing, like fishing or on the field of battle, baseball games, or our own mortality, where we have no idea about this. And when we face these things where we have great uncertainty, yes, they trigger fear in us, but we can't simply run away from things like, say, for example, our impending mortality. There's no escape for it. So how do we cope with this? And the idea and the theory of magical thinking is magical thinking become mechanisms for dealing with this. What they do is they try to provide us causal explanations to bring certainty to an uncertain world. And so instead of facing the fear, for example, of mortality, we might imagine some sort of supernatural force that will come and hold us and take us into account and make us feel better in the face of that sort of existential angst. So I think the first thing we need to know about magical thinking is that magical thinking typically occurs when, one, uncertainty is great, and secondly, when the stakes are high. We face a lot of uncertainty in our lives. Most of our uncertainties are kind of benign, like, will it rain tomorrow? It's probably not that big of a deal. Where we tend to sort of generate a lot of emotional oomph is where that uncertainty has great stakes. Now, the second thing to understand about magical thinking is that it actually has certain kinds of rules. It's not sort of completely unconstrained. It's actually a grammar to our magical thought. And the insight from this came from James Frazer. James Frazer was a Scottish philosopher, also founder of anthropology, and he collected in the late 19th century a large compendium of reports of the cultural practices of different religions across the world and compended them together in a book called The Golden Bough. And Frazer recognized that basically magical thinking tends to follow two types of patterns. The first is what he would call homeopathic magic, or what we call sympathetic magic. And the idea, sympathetic magic. And sympathetic magic is the idea that things that look like each other share certain core common characteristics. And so take, for example, a voodoo doll. If we want to sort of, some religions believe that if you have an effigy of somebody and you want to cause them harm or do them reverence, that effigy somehow or another shares their essence in a core way. The second kind of magic that Fraser identified is what we call homeopathic magic. It's like a contagious kind of magic, that things that have kind of good or evil essences can be transferred with contact to them. So we think that by touching holy people, sort of their essence can be transferred to us. Or if we have contact with something that is taboo or forbidden, that we become, in a sense, polluted by that contact. And he said that these types of tendencies are what really kind of are common across all types of magical beliefs, across all different types of cultures, and really kind of constrain our thinking. Now, the interesting thing about Fraser's work and sort of doing these typologies is that he actually presages the work of contemporary psychologists who now call these things heuristics. And probably the most famous of this would be Danny Kahneman's most recent work on thinking fast and slow. And what Kahneman realized here, he won basically a Nobel Prize, for those of you not familiar with this work, for his work in psychology. And he said that humans, when we're encountering uncertainty, we utilize these things called heuristics. They're information shortcuts that basically help us process and get on in the world, but they're information shortcuts that oftentimes mislead us. And so when we talk about a heuristic, it's a cognitive shortcut for decision making. And whether or not we know it, our brains are constantly employing these types of heuristics in terms of processing information. I'll give you an example of this. This is a Kanziga triangle. And as you know, we cannot help but actually see the shape of a triangle here, even though the triangle itself doesn't really exist. It is actually just suggested by the outside elements. And this is a really good example of what a heuristic is. It's where we fill in the blanks, basically cognitively, even though we get a few pieces of information and we leap to a conclusion from those few pieces of information. Now, these types of heuristics are pervasive in our magical thinking, and I'll give you some examples of this. So in one of my surveys, we asked people, imagine that you were locked in a room, and you were told the key to the room is under one of these objects. One of the other objects, though, is potentially very, very dangerous and lethal. And so which object would you probably need to avoid if you were looking for the key? So, C. Yes, in fact. Oh, and then we also asked the people, which object do you think is least dangerous? E? Yeah, okay, we mixed the responses, and what we found is that 56% of Americans who we sampled thinks that C is the dangerous object. And as we would say, 67% thought that this was the least dangerous object. I don't know what it is. If you really want to fool someone, put something that looks like a kind of misshapen egg, and people think that's safe. Now, obviously, why do we think C is dangerous? Because it kind of resembles a spider. It resembles something that we would think would be a potentially dangerous object. And our thinking, our intuition is to think is to utilize this kind of representativeness, what Kahneman calls a representativeness heuristic, whereby we think that things that look like or resemble other things share their kind of common characteristics. Now, this also happens a lot in our magical beliefs. I'll give you another example here. Our magical beliefs embody these intuitive heuristics. We asked people in our surveys, imagine you were playing the lottery, and suppose that a friend told you he'd won a $5,000 lottery prize by rubbing his ticket on a paper napkin. Would you give it a try? Now, half the sample we told the paper napkin scenario, and the other half of the sample we said a $1 bill. And the interesting thing is whether or not you're reading on a paper napkin or a $1 bill gives you a very, very different kind of response. 40% of the people say, oh, would you rub it on a paper napkin? Would you give it a try? Say, sure, I'd give that a try. Why not? It's costless. But if you say it's a $1 bill, 57% agree. And the idea here is that, as we think something, obviously like, oh, yeah, a $1 bill is going to be much more meaningful. I'm trying to win money. Of course, that will be sort of it will have that effect. And this is how our psychology tends to work. We tend to think that things that resemble each other will share certain characteristics here. So, anyway, let me go back and go to this first. The two pillars of magical thinking, what really animates our magical beliefs is this idea of emotional disequilibria and our susceptibility to these types of heuristics. And so what I'm trying to do in my research here is to measure the propensities and these possibilities across the population, see how they correspond with people's beliefs. I want to get a sense of how open are Americans to magical thinking? And so I've been running a number of surveys. These are the data here. And I want to say, for this part of the talk, I'm going to be presenting some statistics, and I do this with a little hesitation. I have this common story when I'm on a plane and I'm feeling social and people ask me what I do. I say, oh, I teach political science, and then immediately we get into conversations about politics that happens. And if I'm feeling unsocial and people ask me what I do, I say I teach statistics, and the conversation just stops. And I get to sort of read my book or do whatever I want. So I'm going to, with that in mind, I'm going to present some statistics. I'm going to try to hopefully make these as palatable as possible. They are statistics, and I know it's not everybody's appetite. So the question that we had to do is, how do we actually measure magical thinking? We wanted to do something more, myself and my research assistants, wanted to do something more than simply just measure magical beliefs. We wanted to try to measure these processes behind this. And so the first thing is, I work with survey data. I'm very interested in trying to explain patterns across the United States and the American population as a whole. Now, how do you measure something like emotional disequilibria across the population as a whole? Our emotions are difficult to measure in any circumstance, and they tend to be fleeting and episodic. So we settled on two strategies, one of which is we developed what we call our apprehension scale. And we asked people a series of questions, for example, how often they do some, what we would, apprehensive is not the word, cautionary types of behaviors, such as things like wearing a seatbelt when they ride in the back seat of a car, washing after they shake hands with a stranger, locking their luggage at the airport, shredding their bills before they throw them away, locking their car doors when driving, checking the locks and windows on their doors in the houses. And people could give 1 of 5 responses here, and this gives you a quick idea of sort of the distribution. There are some types of behaviors where people do that a lot, like wearing their seatbelts in the back of a car or locking their car doors when driving. Some behaviors that people do a little bit less. But these items all tend to correlate with one another, and we can create actually a pretty nice scale. And so that was one way we're trying to measure some maybe propensity towards emotional disequilibrium. Our thought is that people who are high on this apprehension scale are coping probably with a lot of chronic anxiety. Secondly, we asked what we call a pessimism scale, and we asked people, how likely is it that you think in the coming year or next 10 years some of the following will happen? That the U.S. will have an Ebola outbreak, that a major terrorist attack will occur on U.S. soil, the U.S. economy will go into recession, and the U.S. will go to war. And you could sort of see, people could sort of say this on a 0 to 100 scale, kind of rate the likelihood of this. People sort of give nearly a 50-50 chance for the bottom 3 and about a 1 in 4 chance about an Ebola outbreak. But you can see a distribution on this. And once again, people who tend to be much more pessimistic about these negative things happening, we would sort of say are high on this pessimism scale, and some people are low on this pessimism scale. So that's going to be 2 scales we'll be looking at. And the other one is, how do we gauge people's susceptibility to these heuristics, the grammar of magical thinking? And here we came up with the questions, and I'll sort of take you through this. What we basically do in the survey, at the beginning of the survey, is we ask people, okay, here are going to be a series of paired choices. Please just give us your quickest response to these paired choices of which one you would rather do. And so you can go through and think this if you like. So first question was, would you rather stab a photograph of your family, or stick your hands in a bowl of slimy worms, or sometimes we've asked cockroaches? Yeah. No, okay. Next set of questions. Would you rather yell, "I hope I die tomorrow" out loud 5 times, or ride in a speeding car without a seatbelt? Okay. Would you rather sleep in laundry pajamas, once worn by Charles Manson, or put a nickel in your mouth that you found on the ground? Okay. Would you rather grind your shoes into an unmarked grave, or stand in line for 3 hours at the DMV? Yeah. And finally, would you rather spend the night in a luxurious house where a family was recently murdered, or spend the night in a dingy bus station? Now, as you could probably tell, with all of these, what we're presenting people are a series of choices between something that has what we would call symbolic costs versus something that has tangible costs. The tangible costs are things like picking a nickel off the ground and putting it in your mouth, or riding in a car without a seatbelt, versus something that imposes sort of symbolic costs for people, or metaphorical costs, which is like stabbing a photograph of their family. Now, we're not sort of saying that these costs, that they're not costly. Just because it's symbolic doesn't mean it's not costly. Those things are costly for people, but it's a trade-off here that we're trying to gauge. Our thinking is that people who engage in magical beliefs are much more likely to kind of prioritize these symbols and metaphors in their lives over sort of tangible things. And what we'll see here is in terms of our distributions, we can ask in the American population, about 2/3 of people would rather stick their hand in a bowl of slimy worms and stab a photograph of their family. If you ask it, if you move it to cockroaches, it gets to be more like 50-50. So you see the difference between. We actually spend a lot of time trying to calibrate these items to make sure that they're sort of equivalent. It splits a little bit more evenly between people who would rather would ride without a seatbelt rather than yell, I hope I die tomorrow. Once again, 2/3 would rather put a nickel in the ground than sleep in lawn or pajamas once worn by Charles Manson. Nearly 70% would say they'd rather stand in line at the DMV. And I was really surprised by this one because I can imagine a few things more painful than standing in line at the DMV. It's split once again about 50-50 between the luxurious house and the grimy bus station. We can put these together in terms of a distribution and on a scale, and it looks something like this. And I want to point out that there are people at sort of the ends of this tail end. So these are what I would call my tangible thinkers. These are people who always will, avoid a tangible cost, and they're relatively insensitive to these metaphorical or symbolic costs. They don't, they will never put a nickel in their ground. They don't mind sleeping in Charles Manson's pajamas. Our symbolic thinkers are just the opposite. They're the ones who are very, very sensitive to these symbols and metaphors, and they'll take tangible cost to avoid the symbolic cost. So what we want to do is then, we have these three scales set up here, this apprehension, pessimism, and symbolic thinking, and how do they correspond with magical beliefs? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how some of these differences here. So what we have is our scales here, our symbolic thinking, pessimism, and apprehension, and these are the percent of people who believe in some various phenomena across these scales. And what we basically see is, with respect to all three of these scales, things like believing in an observant God. And this was a question, do you believe that there's an observant God who's keenly interested and involved in the affairs of your life? Do you believe in angels? Do you believe in Satan? All of these things increase, the percentage of people increase dramatically as they become either more apprehensive, more pessimistic, or more oriented toward a symbolic scale. Is this all clear in terms of these relationships being shown? Yeah. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm putting together three different variables here. So this is the symbolic thinking scale, this is the pessimism scale, and these are 5 quintiles on each of the scales. And what we're looking at is just the percentages for each of those groups. So it's like it's a way of presenting 3 figures at once. Does that answer your question? I'd like us to be clear. I'm going to go through some of these, and so if that's not clear, I'm happy to try to explain some more.
It is not clear to me.
Oh, okay.
But I don't want to waste your time.
Oh, you are not. Let me bring this up. Why did this?
Got a job update.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so let me talk you through this. So basically here, say we'll take our symbolic thinking scale. At the end of this, at this end of the symbolic thinking scale are our tangible thinkers. And we're moving from tangible thinkers to our symbolic thinkers. And this one we're moving from people who are least pessimistic, they really don't think a high likelihood of sort of negative things happening, to people who are most pessimistic. And then here are people who are least apprehensive, least likely to engage in these apprehensive behaviors, the most apprehensive. Does that explain that now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what we're seeing here is across all three of these scales, the percentages believing in these magic phenomena really increase. And for someone who works in public opinion data, we were really struck by these differences. These are really, really significant differences in levels of belief across these scales. So we see this with believing in these supernatural phenomena. We also ask some sort of general ontological types of questions, like, do you believe that life has a purpose? Or that, even if we have a question that specifically, if you do something that a bad thing and you don't get caught, eventually you'll have to pay for it. This kind of imminent justice reasoning that children have a lot. And we see these types of ideas also tend to increase, these types of intuitions increase across all of these scales. We ask some questions that I'll explain this later in the talk. These are really common amongst fundamentalists. And the idea is that the Bible is the inerrant word of God. The belief in end times, that we're living in end times as foretold by biblical prophecy. Do you believe in the power of prayer? Or do you believe that there are hidden codes in the Bible that people can believe? These types of beliefs really increase strongly across each of these scales. And I'm going to come back to this in a second here. But it's not just simply supernatural beliefs. Paranormal beliefs, beliefs in reincarnation, ESP, ghosts, the power of positive thinking. All of these tend to sort of increase as well. Not quite the same kind of clear linear pattern, a little bit noisier. They're noisier, they're less common beliefs, but we're seeing something similar here. The percent who believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, on the other hand, dramatically, at least across two of these scales, dramatically decreases here. And then we ask some questions about intuition. So, for example, in matters when making an important decision, do you tend to follow your heart or do you follow your head? That's the blue line. Would you rather trust ordinary people than experts and intellectuals when it comes to important facts? Once again, this question, will eliminating gluten make you more healthy? And is alternative medicine more effective for most illnesses? Here, the relationships are not as strong as we sort of see for the supernatural beliefs, but they do tend to follow a very similar type of pattern, which is that people sort of at the high end of these scales tend to be more likely to think of these things. Finally, on this particular set of scales, we asked a series of questions about conspiracy theories. So some of my research is, and a lot of this actually got started by why people believe in conspiracy theories. And we also sort of see that people who are higher on these three scales tend to be more supportive of conspiracy theories, particularly pessimism. People who believe in conspiracy theories tend to be pretty pessimistic in terms of their orientation towards the world. So this would tell us, at least I think we're getting to what is animating this type of magical thinking? How is this changing people's orientation to the world? Which brings me to politics. So I don't know any of you who might have watched the Republican debate last week, but a lot of the language, rhetoric, and symbols that are common in magical thinkings were very, very pervasive in the rhetoric of some of the debaters. And particularly, at least 4 of the candidates who have identified themselves very strongly as evangelical Christians. And in this, their language is evoking, I think, the intuitive concerns of this magical thinking and the magical beliefs of fundamentalists. And let me explain how this might work. So once again, when we sort of say we can measure what we call fundamentalist religiosity by these 4 measures of living in end times, problems being solved by prayer, Bible is the inerrant word of God, and they're hidden goods in the Bible. And you can see that large percentages of Americans agree with these statements. I would say at least 30 to 40% of Americans, somewhere in that range, score what we would call positive in our fundamentalists by these measures. You can see there's a large percentage that also sort of disagree with these particular items. And then some of them, people are very uncertain, are somewhat agnostic on them. And I want to talk about these 3 divisions in a moment here when we start thinking about, but first let's look about how the American population divides on these measures. So by fundamentalist, what I'm going to do is people who consistently on average score in the blue range here, who are in agreement with all 4 of these issues. And these are what I would call fundamentalists here. If you look at people by their self-described ideology, there are a very small percentage of liberals who also harbor these fundamentalist beliefs. And even then, they all tend to identify as Democrats in this way. If people ask who identify themselves as moderate or not having an ideology, we sort of see a smaller percentage would identify as fundamentalist. They're still predominantly Democrats, although a lot more of them are independent or not partisanly affiliated. And then if you look at people who identify as conservative, you can see a much, much larger percentage also identify themselves as fundamentalists, and you can see here's the the hegemony of the Republican Party amongst this group. Now, one thing I really want to talk about here is we hear a lot in our public discourse about this ideological gulf between liberals and conservatives, red states and blue states. Liberals drive Volvos, drink Starbucks. All this stuff. Conservatives, like NASCAR, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot is made of this ideological gulf in the United States, but I think that actually misses the point. Most Americans are not really bound by their ideologies in any tight way. There's a small percentage of people who really think in purely ideological terms. Where I think the much bigger gulf comes is not between liberals and conservatives, it's between people who utilize magical thinking and magical beliefs as their primary orientation for understanding the world, and people who don't. And in some ways, that's a much larger ontological breach to try to cover. It's like, as my friend Linda and I. You know, she believes in the Bible, I believe in reason. Once she sort of said that, it was great. We actually stopped arguing because we realized that there's just no way we could communicate with each other. And, you know, now we just talk about food. You know, and I think that what we're seeing here is, you know, the predominance of, particularly in terms of fundamentalists who really embrace this the set of magical beliefs. It's not simply that they embrace these magical beliefs, they also really embrace a magical orientation to the world. And that's creating a big gulf, not just between them and then people on this side of the political spectrum, but also within the Republican Party. And I think a lot of the fissures and fractures right now that's going on in the Republican primary debate is reflecting this big, big gulf amongst Republicans who orient themselves as fundamentalists and those who are not. And let me show you just a few pieces of evidence of that. I think fundamentalists, like all magical thinkers, they follow their intuitions first. And how do we see this? Well, let's compare to some basic policy items and opinions on policy items. Now, there are some political scientists like to talk about different types of policy opinions. There are some things that are called hard issues. And what we mean by hard issues, these are issues that tend to require a lot of factual knowledge. They have a lot of technical specification. There's something that if you're just asked about and you don't know anything about politics, it's going to be hard to frame an opinion about. And so fiscal policy is a classic example of this. And we ask people, for example, you know, should, for example, we have a flat tax? Or do we need less regulation of key industries? Or should we cut welfare spending? You can have maybe a gut reaction to that, but most people who have a considered reaction to that is based on some other sort of deductive, you know, preferences here. And what we see here is this is where ideology tends to sort of exert a lot of influence. Like, once again, small percentage of Americans are ideological, but, you know, conservatives tend to have very consistently conservative viewpoints here. And what this scale is looking at, once again, we have liberals, moderates, and conservatives. And within each of these groups, we're looking at 3 points on our fundamentalism scale. People who are non-fundamentalist, people who, that's on the left-hand side, people who are agnostic in the middle, and then people who score high on the fundamentalist side. And so, just to let you know, we have a point here. This is a very small percentage of the American population right here amongst our liberals who are fundamentalists. Meanwhile, our conservatives are more evenly distributed across these 3 points. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So anyway, if we look at things like fiscal policy, just asking basic questions about fiscal policy, we see that, you know, liberals and moderates tend to be pretty close to each other. Conservatives tend to be a little bit more farther apart than the rest of the population. And fundamentalism doesn't really affect people's opinions all that much. If anything, fundamentalist conservatives tend to be a little bit more liberal in their fiscal policies. However, we can ask questions in different kinds of ways that make a hard issue an easy issue. And by what we mean by easy issues are issues that you don't necessarily need to have a lot of factual knowledge to give an answer to. It's a sense of moral right and wrong. So, for example, we can compare a classic fiscal question, which is, now that the economy is doing better, it is time to raise taxes on the top income brackets to pay down the deficit. And once again, we see a classic pattern of, you know, liberals and moderates kind of down here, conservatives up here, and no real differences by people's religious beliefs. However, if we rephrase the question and we say, every time we raise taxes by 10%, we lose 10% of our liberty, you see a much different pattern in people's beliefs. Here you see less difference amongst liberals, moderates, and conservatives, and a much stronger difference amongst fundamentalists within each of those particular groups. And what we're suggesting here is how politics gets framed in particular, when politicians try to emphasize these intuitive understandings of politics, they can elicit out these types of orientations, particularly among our magical thinkers who are very, very high in their intuitionist thinking. Let me give you some other examples of this. When you talk about moral issues here, for example, things like gay marriage, banning abortion, legalizing marijuana, restricting the right to die, here we see that, in fact, ideology stops becoming a very important predictor. It's a small predictor, but not a great predictor. What really drives people's opinions on, and these are what political scientists call quote-unquote easy issues, meaning that, once again, these are issues that you don't necessarily have you need a factual knowledge to make a kind of informed opinion about. And it's really fundamentalism here that becomes a very, very big predictor. And I think if we think about sort of the issues that frame people's orientations towards politics, wow, these are their intuitions. This is what people are feeling powerful about. And if you think about what is gay marriage, banning abortion, you know, intoxicants or drugs or death, they all invoke these existential concerns with control, mortality, uncertainty, apprehension. We also see this with some other items too, and this was to me really striking. Thinking that against whether or not people are against mandatory vaccines, they favor subsidizing homeschooling, banning GMOs, thinking that gluten is bad for you. Once again, we see this similar pattern, these intuitions coming to the fore amongst our fundamentalists who have very, very different views from their co-ideologues on all of these issues. And once again, on conspiracy theories. I think one of the things that's powerful and seductive about conspiracy theories is that they do appeal to these types of intuitions. They actually create, in a very uncertain world with a lot of competing influences and forces, a conspiracy theory is a powerful narrative because it locates the cause of some event in a nefarious source that's evil. And there's a good and there's evil in the world, and there's an evil force out there. And so our intuitionists, which I think are disproportionate among fundamentalists, really tend to subscribe to conspiracy theories. And these are conspiracy theories that are not just right-wing conspiracy theories. They're ideas like conspiracy theories about Wall Street orchestrating sort of the financial collapse intentionally in order to increase the power of the Federal Reserve. Vaccine cover-ups, cell phone causing cancers, the truther movement, the 9/11 truther conspiracy theory. And of course, we see the birther conspiracy theory here as well. So, what does this mean? I think to me, the standpoint, it's a way of understanding what are some of the big gulfs and rifts in our current political conversations. And understanding that I think, once again, the real challenge for us as a polity is how do we talk across, it's not this gap between liberals and conservatives, which I think makes conversation and coming together much more difficult. It's this much bigger ontological gap between intuitionist, kind of magical thinking, kind of a pre-Enlightenment orientation towards the world, and people who hold a kind of more post-Enlightenment, reason-based orientation to the world. And I will leave it at that, because I'll be interested in hearing your questions when we have time for that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for all the mic that are.
Oh, I think the mic.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a weird question. What would you say about an obsessive compulsive person who has to go through rituals of numbers and so forth, who is a total non-believer and a believer in chaos?
Okay, so the question would be, how would somebody, for example, who might not necessarily hold a lot of other magical beliefs, but otherwise be, say, obsessive, compulsive, and utilize certain kinds of practices or beliefs, how does this relate to them? And I'm going to make a couple of things clear here. I think we all engage in magical thinking of some kind. I think they reflect these innate propensities in us, and I don't mean to suggest that we don't all engage in these tendencies. The question is do these manifest themselves in particular beliefs for us? Now, for me, the interesting question is not that there are some beliefs that are right and some beliefs that are wrong, but rather what utility our beliefs hold for us. And, to the extent that our beliefs, like I said before, I think our magical beliefs, people hold on to them because they are emotionally comforting, and they provide real emotional benefits. And I think that's why a lot of times it's very hard to talk about with people if you don't share their magical beliefs about their magical beliefs, because they help sustain their emotional equilibrium. They become kind of core to their whole psychological well-being. And that's why it's very, very difficult to talk across that bridge, or across that divide. For someone who, say, has an OCD issue and is using these types of beliefs in order to, placate themselves, that's part of the utility of the belief itself. And at some point, that is what they're using to cope. I think what becomes difficult is when we move from, say, individuals who may be using beliefs for their own particular purposes to people who take these beliefs and then want to extrapolate them onto public concerns. And as a political scientist, this is something that I'm kind of keenly sensitive to where people's political priorities become informed and public policy gets informed by this perspective of magical thinking. And I think that becomes a big challenge for us as a democracy. Democracy is an enlightenment institution. It's really supposed to be an institution about reasoned discourse. And I think if you look throughout history where democracy, one of the ways democracies oftentimes fall prey to undemocratic influences is in the spell, to use the term, of magical thinking and magical beliefs.
Fabulous talk, thank you. I'm curious about people who are believe in the right to carry and with guns, because that's clearly changed here. And if you've done any research at all on that kind of stuff. And are there 5 magical believers on the Supreme Court? Sorry.
I'm going to pass on the last one, just because I have not administered my surveys to them. It'd be interesting. As far as the interesting thing, I didn't present the data here, but one of the things that correlates very strongly with magical thinking are kind of preoccupation with gun rights. And it's interesting because there's a real big divorce between people who are buying guns and the phenomena of wanting to hold guns and the reality about whether guns actually would make you any safer. And I think this is a hallmark of magical thinking, whereas you're holding a belief that having a gun is going to protect you in some ways, when the reality is the gun has a minuscule impact on actually making you safer, and in fact may make you in more peril in some regards. Now, when we look at our data here, to go back up, if you would say I have a couple of questions asking about gun rights and right to carry, and boy, our fundamentalists really, really strong on these elements here. And they tend to be much, much more fervent about that. And I think it's because of guns as a symbol. It's not simply just about hunting and sport use. It's really about this strong symbol. The other thing that's very interesting about this, and I was thinking a little bit more about this, and I ran this correlation between the percent of the population that had voted for President Obama in 2012 and the white gun murder rate in the state. I'm looking at the sort of state-to-state correlation. And it's really a remarkably strong correlation. Basically, if you look at states where Obama had a lot of support, like, say, Massachusetts or even in Illinois, the rate of white gun deaths are actually really, really low. If you look at states like Wyoming or South Carolina or Oklahoma, these are states with very high white homicide rates. Now, there's no relationship with African Americans and homicide rates, but just looking at white gun deaths. So the states that typically, I think, you would sort of have this culture that's very fervently pro-gun tend to be very, very, I don't know if you saw the Republican debate. There's like, Obama wants to take your guns away and restrict you from your gun rights and, bring the UN in to come and police you. This is the kind of rhetoric that's being fomented. But I wonder if there's a sense of profound insecurity in people in these states. There's a lot of white homicide in the states that in blue states, whites don't really experience to the same extent. And so I don't know if, to what extent what fuels the apprehension around guns, but it does seem to correspond at least by some indicators with a greater homicide rate. I mean, this is going to be a very complicated causal story to piece out, but so I think there's some apprehension there.
I have 3 questions. Do you know if the similar research has been done in developed European countries, and how does that compare to the United States? That's one. Second question, if there is a research that shows developing of these tendencies in the United States over a course of time, as the time passes, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And the last one, given what you presented and your admission that you can't even really discuss this type of stuff with your friend who has fundamentally different approach to life, how do you approach it politically?
So the answer to your first question is no, I don't know yet. I'm excited when I'm in the process of writing this book for this research, and when this is done, my next step is actually to go and look at Europe. And just because it's easy to collect data from Europeans, I like to look at the whole world, but Europe is the next logical step. And there's some interesting questions like are the Italians or the Greeks more magical in their thinking than the Danes. You know, one might think that they would be, but maybe not. So we don't know. On the second question, over time, you know, we haven't really collected data on these things over time. Americans have a long history of embracing conspiracy theories and organizing themselves around conspiracy theories. There's also these periods of great kind of fundamentalist revivalism in American history, these great awakenings that occur. Even, in fact, the growth of fundamentalism as a movement really started in the 1920s, when there was a feeling that sort of mainstream Protestantism was becoming too linked to modernity and too secularized in some sense. And this is, the fundamentalists wanted to go back to a charismatic, intuitive, emotional understanding of religion. Now, I think what has changed is that up until the 1970s, fundamentalists tend to be very divorced from politics. They really, with a few exceptions of things like the temperance movement, they really stayed back out of partisan politics. But with the rise of the moral majority and some leaders like Pat Robertson, you've seen a much more greater politicization of fundamentalists in that way. And I think this is sort of what may be changing the nature of political discourse. And like I said, I think one reason why we see this greater increase in polarization around discourse is by this interjection and this equation of fundamentalist belief to one end of the political spectrum. And then the last question, you know, so I get this a lot, which is how do we talk across this divide? How do we bridge this gulf? And that's a hard thing to know. And the best answer I've been able to come up with is now, and I don't mean for this to sound condescending, but it was the insight that I had from working with my children, which is that when my kids love magical thinking, they're just full of magical beliefs. As my 6-year-old said, you know, he said to me, you know, he was having a fight with a friend of his at school who said that God didn't exist. They go to the lab school in Hyde Park, you know, it's all very like, God is dead, and they're thinking at that at kindergarten. And, you know, and my son wants to believe in God, and he was really upset because, like, you know, I want to believe in God because, you know, life is funner when you believe in God and when it's not, you know. And I was like, okay. And, you know, but so when he has these kinds of magical beliefs and magical thinking, you know, when he's having any kind of way that he's not being rational or reasonable, me trying to reason with him and trying to argue with him just goes nowhere. But me empathizing with him is always the first step. So when I sit down and I sort of say to him, I say, I understand your feeling, I understand your fear. And that immediately he calms down. And at that point, we can begin to have a conversation. And I think this is what we need to have more of in terms of our political discourse. It's not less like I'm right, you're wrong, kind of, this is why you're wrong. It's more, wow, you're feeling afraid. You're feeling apprehensive. Yes, the world is a scary place. Let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge those feelings and validate them and say that they're real. And then maybe we can go from there, use that as a mechanism for sort of talking across some of these issues. How that, you know, I don't see a lot of politicians talking in those terms. I don't know how that would actually work. I don't know if you know, a lot of people even have the appetite to go there. But that to me seems to be, it has to be about some empathy, first and foremost.
Is there any relationship between IQ and degree of magical thinking that you are aware of?
So one of the chapters in the book I ask is the question, who is enchanted? And at some level, all of us are. And so when I look at, say, for example, the apprehension scales or pessimism scales or the symbolic thinking scales, I was curious what the correlates would be. And I asked a whole bunch of different things. Education tends to correlate with these things. People who are less educated tend to be more symbolic thinkers, tend to be more pessimistic. You can read that in a number of ways. One thing that our schools do, though, you know, I don't think the reason-based approach of the Enlightenment is in any way intuitive to us. Like I said, my kids are tremendous magical thinkers because I think that's how we intuitively understand the world. We look for causation. We look for causality. We think that things that look like each other should share certain properties. That, you know, oh, that touched that poo, that becomes gross. You know, things like that kind of fear of contagion is very exaggerated in my children. And I think that's what we all have. And what we learn through schooling is we learn about things like conditional probabilities or reasoned discourse. And these are things that have to be trained into us. So education does correlate. The one thing that I was kind of curious about personality and some of these other factors and how they come into play. There were two things that struck me in terms of my data about people who tended to be more magical thinking. And it really wasn't about IQ. But there's a measure, one of my colleagues at University of Chicago named John Cassiopo, who's a really lovely man, a wonderful psychologist, and he developed this idea about need for cognition, that some people just like to think. They like to do crossword puzzles, they like to figure out how things work. They show up on cold, snowy mornings to places to hear academics talk. So, there are people who are engaged with ideas, and that correlates somewhat with education, but it's because maybe people who are like that tend to sort of put themselves through school more. But, according to his work, that's a trait that seems to be distributed across the population. People who are strong in need for cognition tend to be very low magical thinkers. People who are low in need for cognition, who don't really want to think and don't like thinking too much, they tend to be high in magical thinking. The other thing was we had some questions about sort of disgust sensitivity that psychologists have come up with. Like some people are easily disgusted and are very sensitive to these kinds of disgust things, and other people are not. People who are very, very sensitive to disgusting issues. Like one of the examples of this is you ask people, for example, say they see a glass and you put a cockroach in it, and then you take the cockroach out and then you wash the glass and then you pour a liquid in it. Would you still want to drink it? And they would say, no. That's like, and would you do it for $10? No. Would you do it for $20? No. And so, you can raise the scale by how much you're willing to pay them before they finally succumb and sort of say, okay, for $1 million, yeah. And that's our disgust sensitivity. We have other more sophisticated measures than that, but I'm just giving you an example. And people who tend to be very high on this disgust sensitivity. So some of these heuristics that we talk about that inform our magical beliefs, I think some people are just more susceptible to. And I'll give you another example of this. My wife, Thea Goodman, is a novelist. Go out, buy her book. And I gave her the sort of diagnostic tale, and she tends up to be a tremendous symbolic thinker. And we were talking about this, and she said, well, I'm an artist. Of course, I think metaphorically all the time. This is part of my creative process, is to live in a world of symbols and metaphors. And so I think, it's when we think about this orientation towards symbolic thinking, it's not necessarily I want to emphasize, it's not a sign of a cognitive deficiency in any way. It's just a different kind of orientation towards the world.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. Two quick, one, we had Chris Mooney here a year or two ago talking about the Republican brain.
Yeah.
And if I reread that book with this in my head, would it look like he did a good job, a bad job? Is it pretty similar? Are there important differences or similarities? My second real quick question is how this informs not just how people react to ideas, but what ideas seem worth attending to. And I asked that question because one of our members here, who's from a very fundamentalist family, one of the things he said that I never thought of before was because they come from there's going to be the rapture.
Right.
So issues like Social Security running out of money doesn't matter.
Yes.
Because the rapture's coming.
Right.
And so you can't even engage in a bunch of public policy debates because they're not going to happen.
Right.
So the agenda formation thing and the priorities of what's worth attending to, how does this shape that?
With respect, it's been a while since I read Chris's book. I think this kind of research is very, very different from what they were looking at the time. There was a few years ago when the sort of breakthroughs in neuroscience and fMRI technology came up, and suddenly we could get these beautiful pictures of the brain. And for social scientists like myself, it's like, ooh, wow, we can see what's going on in the brain. And I've actually worked with some psychologists on campus, and we tried to do some experiments. And actually, it's really, really hard to know what goes. The brain is incredibly complicated, and it's even if you see some area of the brain lighting up and sort of says, oh, when people think of Hillary Clinton, this part of the brain lights up, and that part of the brain does this. Probably not. From a scientific standpoint, it's going to be very hard to kind of make that case. So I'm trying to actually get at what I think it's a different orientation, and a lot of this. Some of you might have read John Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. He has this idea of sort of that there are these moral foundations. And a lot of this research came out of my critique of that, which is the idea that liberals and conservatives somehow or another are fundamentally different. And this is what I want to complicate. I don't think it's liberals and conservatives. I think it's people who have a different kind of ontology here. To your second question, let me show you one other. Oh, come on. So we asked people in the survey if they identified themselves as conservative, and we gave them a choice and sort of said, say you could do one thing in politics, and they're between one of two choices. What would you rather do? And we asked them, would you rather restrict abortion rights or permanently reduce taxes by 20%? Now, if they're a non-fundamentalist, only 20% of them said that they would rather restrict abortion rights over permanently reducing taxes. Among fundamentalists, 65% here. We asked them, would you rather ban gay marriage or strengthen national defense? Non-fundamentalists, very few of them are very interested in banning gay marriage. 40% of them would say they would, amongst fundamentalists, would rather ban gay marriage and strengthen national defense. These are sort of the pillars of the Republican Party that we're talking about here. Allowing prayer school over repealing the Affordable Care Act. Once again, 70% of fundamentalists would rather allow school prayer than repeal the Affordable Care Act, even though if you ask them, they overwhelmingly hate Obamacare. It's another, like guns, I think it has a very symbolically potent issue for them. Whereas non-fundamentalists, it's a much smaller percentage. So I don't know if that gives you an answer to your question somewhere. I think it's a lot about priorities and where people's priorities. Now, it is an interesting thing, because if you do think that we're living in end times, yeah, why plan for the future? Who cares about climate change? You know, we're all going to be lifted up to heaven, so let's drill, baby, drill, yeah. Well, okay, yeah. Point taken. Yeah. The chosen are going to be, I've been looking for that, and one of the things I was curious about is, you know, if that were the case, then, yeah, you wouldn't care about social insurance programs at all. That's a harder one. I don't think people actually, you would think that that's what they would do. I don't think they connect the dots that well in practice. But a reasoned person would make those deductions. An intuitionist just feels that way. Hi.
As far as trying to minimize the effects of magical thinking, metaphorical thinking, I mean, education, obviously, but what do you think of the idea, George Lakoff, said metaphorical thinking is inevitable, so you have to basically, if you can't beat them, join them. And liberals should just find a better way of using the metaphor. In other words, which is the best strategy, or do you need both?
Yes, so for those of you who don't know George Lakoff, this idea, he has a book called Moral Politics, and the notion is that, and I think you're right, we employ metaphors constantly in our way of understanding the world. Metaphors are one of our prime heuristics. They're a way of simplifying phenomena that we don't observe directly. So we're continually talking, and when it comes to politics in particular, we really use metaphors. We say that his arguments are indefensible. He went on the attack with his statement. And you can read media coverage, for example, of the debates. They're filled with these metaphors of like fights, like it's some sort of hand-to-hand combat. So metaphors are inevitable. And I think the interesting thing so what one of his arguments is that, conservatives tend to employ very paternalistic metaphors. They tend to be drawn to metaphors of strong fathers and determined outcomes and authoritative belief. And liberals tend to employ more nurturant, feminine types of metaphors in their language, and it tends to be about caring and holding. And so what Lakoff was sort of saying is, Lakoff's arguments oftentimes materialize a lot when Democratic fortunes are doing poorly, and the Democrats begin to sort of wonder, what are we doing wrong? And they're like, we're not using the right metaphors, and we need to use better metaphors. I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. The party's fortunes rise and fall based on a lot of other conditions that have nothing to do with their rhetoric or their speech. And so, we've had an African American president for the past 7 years. who's gotten sort of pretty large electoral support and not having to resort to different kinds of metaphors. I think it is important, though, in terms of understanding the metaphors that the other side does as a cue or clue to what they're thinking about. And in terms of thinking about, I don't mean to, part of what I try to do is I try to stay as nonpartisan in my orientation towards politics, because that's a really dangerous trap to fall into and trying to understand the world. But watching as a citizen, watching the Republican debate and seeing the level of animosity and the fervent kind of metaphorical use that was there is really startling, that this is one of our major parties where the tone of discourse was really around so divorced from any kind of reasoned discourse of reality here, and this is how they're trying to acquire a nomination. And as a citizen, that just is troubling. And I don't think our response should be, oh, we need to necessarily find better metaphors. I think the key here might be, who are we trying to communicate to? And I'm sorry this is a long-winded answer to your question. But the other thing to bear in mind is there's a large percentage of the American population that really doesn't have any appetite for politics. Doesn't follow political information very carefully. Will just basically see what other cues they have. They're much more interested in kind of following just, other concerns. The way I explained, I was giving a talk about Donald Trump last week. And to me, like, what explains Donald Trump's support is, I don't know if you know this fact, that on a good night or a good day, probably their best day, Fox News may have 3 million viewers. Any idea how many people watch The Apprentice? 24 million. Far, far more people are watching, sort of attuned to other concerns. So when it comes to someone like Donald Trump, yeah, he's the guy who fires people in The Apprentice. He seems like a president, boss there, sure. And so, when we get to, I think the challenge is how do you, and when people who don't think very hard about politics very closely, and they're suddenly, they have this citizenship obligation imposed on them, and they have to vote and make a preference and express a preference. How do you communicate to those folks? And this is where I think metaphors become important. And maybe what we can do is think about how magical thinking occurs and what are people susceptible to. And I would say, people do think that things that are like each other will share certain common characteristics. And that can happen, we could use that in a negative way. I think that's the basis of a lot of, for example, racial stereotyping, is that kind of heuristic at play. But we might be able to translate that in a positive way, too. We might want to think about contagion heuristics and be appreciative of that. Maybe people are sensitive to that. So if we're, depending on what kind of information we want to communicate, yes, we can probably come up with metaphors. I'm not sure it's the metaphorical diagnosis that Lakoff puts forth. But at least what I would say here is I'm hopeful that maybe my research can help inform how we go about trying to have a reasoned political discourse and at least be appreciative of the bounds of reason and the pitfalls or kind of cognitive pitfalls that people are falling into and what keeps them from engaging in reasoned discourse. I'm sorry if that's kind of a rambling answer.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more quick questions. I'll do one from the floor and one from the balcony.
Yeah, I was interested in specifically your critiques against Righteous Minds, which is an alternative explanation for the differences. He claims that there are like 6 different values which are, proven both interculturally and in social biology. And it's just rationally, or not rationally, but it's derived from which ones you hold to explain the difference.
Sure. So Jonathan Haidt, who I'm a friendly acquaintance with, he has an idea that basically there are 6 moral foundations that are these sort of innate foundations that guide us. And they're things like, not harming someone, are things fair, your orientation towards authority, your orientation towards purity, your sense of loyalty. I'll just take those 5 for now. And what he finds basically is that if he asks these on these survey questions how people, the importance they place on these different values and this sort of self-reported importance they place on these values. And he finds that, liberals and conservatives really don't differentiate on the values of fairness or caring. They tend to be relatively similar. But where they really differentiate on these values of authority, purity, and loyalty. Now, I was, as a public opinion specialist, I was a little worried about sort of the survey instruments, and also, so I replicated them in one of my surveys, and basically what I found is, sure, we found this difference here, but once you take into account people's fundamentalist beliefs, those differences go away. And what made me pause was, I don't know if concerns about authority, purity, and loyalty are innate, or if those are part and parcel of a fundamentalist doctrine. And I think, and this is actually what really has motivated this book. I think what he's sort of identifying as this difference between liberals and conservatives, once you take into account people's fundamentalist beliefs, those differences disappear. But what we do see are big differences between fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists. And it was actually as a part of that critique, I was like, well, what's going on with these fundamentalists? And that's where I started thinking about, oh, this is really kind of a pre-Enlightenment way of understanding the world. And so my critique of John is actually a constructive critique, which is that I'm indebted to him. A lot of his other works actually has helped inform this work. But I sort of see this as, okay, I find something different, but here's what I think is what's going on with the difference. So.
Time for one last question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. First, real quickly, could you put up the slide with the sample sizes and data numbers just for my own curiosity?
Sure. If you want, sure.
And then my question is kind of going back to the first question I was asked about OCD. How do you see mental illness playing into magical thinking and this application of it all? Because a lot of what you've talked about is very similar to how people deal with mental illness. It's not like escalation techniques. You talk to them very empathetically, and what they're going through. And there seems to be a lot of similarities between people who think magically and people who have a mental illness or are mentally ill in some way. And you have defined this as like a different ways of thinking. Do you think it's just a sliding scale or anything along those lines? So
one thing I would characterize on this, I think it's common for people who don't share a magical belief to think that that belief is a significant of some kind of mental deficiency or pathological in some ways. No, I mean, it goes across the spectrum, but we just sort of, I imagine like, for example, it's a common belief in China and Korea that it's really bad luck to sign your name with a red pen. We're like, oh, wow, but, that's a belief that's strong, and it's very firmly held, and then our beliefs, that a lot of us would hold probably would be equally suspect across the board. And I think this is one of the difficulties that we have. I mean, as a social scientist, this is a really big occupational hazard, which is we kind of think that the world, everybody thinks like we do. And, what we forget is, no, we are very educated, erudite, weird people, actually, a way. Most people, understand the world in a much, much more intuitive way. And so, sometimes we can take, I think the archetype of this was Freud, who, used mental pathologies as a model for trying to understand the psyche writ large and sort of as a way to sort of delve into the psyche and as a way to delve into unconscious. And so I think what we see oftentimes, we can see a lot of magical beliefs are common amongst people who might have some kind of diagnosable pathology because they are trying to cope. And these magical beliefs are coping mechanisms, and they can be very, very potent coping mechanisms for people. And so it's important to sort of say, but just because people are using this for coping doesn't mean necessarily the beliefs themselves are. I want to just differentiate that. It's not that they're indicative of any kind of deficiency. I think they're intuitive and they're natural. And for people who may be struggling with chronic anxiety or some other kind of issue where the world seems really scary and perilous, they're trying whatever they can to sort of make sense of it all, to gain some sense of control and restore some emotional equilibrium. And if, boy, having superstitions and talismans and various things are what they use, that's their kind of form of self-help.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor Oliver.
Thank you very much.